You think borders are just lines on a map? Think again. Nations don't just defend their land, they create space to survive. But what happens when that space disappears? What if your country had no room to fall back, no margin for error? Welcome to the world of strategic depth, the invisible shield that has shaped wars, alliances, and entire civilizations. Throughout history, nations have sought to secure themselves from external threats through various means, one of the most critical being the establishment of strategic depth. This concept, fundamental to geopolitical thought, refers to the physical, political, and sometimes even economic space a country maintains between its core territory and potential aggressors. At its core, strategic depth is about survival, ensuring that a country has enough room to absorb and repel an attack, rather than being immediately overwhelmed. The role of buffer zones in achieving strategic depth is pivotal, as they act as shields, absorbing the impact of military invasions, mitigating economic pressure, and often serving as a bargaining chip in international diplomacy. The necessity of strategic depth is most apparent in land warfare, where geography dictates how conflicts unfold. Countries with vast expanses, such as Russia, have historically relied on their sheer territorial size to neutralize invaders. Napoleon's forces discovered this painfully in 1812 when, after advancing deep into Russian territory, they were met not only with military resistance, but also with the brutal forces of geography and climate. Similarly, Nazi Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 encountered the same challenges. The Soviets, aware of their strategic depth, conducted a scorched earth policy, retreating while forcing their enemy to extend supply lines beyond sustainable limits. This illustrates the advantage that buffer zones and territorial depth provide in conventional warfare. Conversely, nations lacking strategic depth often face existential vulnerabilities. Poland, a country historically situated between powerful neighbors, has been partitioned and invaded multiple times due to its flat geography and lack of natural barriers. Without strategic depth, Poland repeatedly found itself the battlefield of European conflicts, particularly during World War II. The same can be said for Belgium, which, due to its geographic position between France and Germany, became a frequent passageway for invading armies. In contrast, countries such as the United Kingdom and Japan have relied on natural buffers, the sea, to provide them with a form of strategic depth, protecting them from immediate invasion while allowing them to project power beyond their borders. In the modern era, buffer zones have evolved beyond just territorial barriers. During the Cold War, Eastern Europe served as a crucial buffer for the Soviet Union against NATO. The Warsaw Pact countries, such as Poland, East Germany, and Czechoslovakia, formed a defensive layer against any potential Western advance into Soviet territory. The fall of the Soviet Union saw NATO expand eastward, bringing the alliance closer to Russia's borders, a geopolitical shift that significantly reduced Russia's strategic depth and contributed to ongoing tensions, particularly in Ukraine. For Russia, Ukraine is not just a neighboring country, it is an essential buffer against Western influence. The annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the ongoing conflict in eastern Ukraine are direct consequences of Russia's fear of losing its remaining strategic depth in Europe. Beyond traditional military applications, strategic depth also plays a role in maritime security. Nations with expansive coastlines often seek to establish naval buffer zones to protect their interests. The United States, for instance, has long maintained a network of naval bases across the Pacific to prevent threats from reaching its mainland. Similarly, China's aggressive expansion in the South China Sea is a direct manifestation of its desire for strategic depth. By controlling artificial islands and exerting influence over critical shipping lanes, China is creating a buffer that extends its defensive perimeter far from its mainland. This is not just about territorial control, but about ensuring that potential adversaries, such as the US or regional rivals like India and Japan, cannot easily threaten China's core economic and military hubs. The rise of modern warfare and technological advancements have somewhat altered the role of traditional buffer zones, but they have not made them obsolete. While missiles, cyber warfare, and air power mean that physical distance is less of an obstacle than in the past, having buffer zones still provides critical advantages. Even in the age of rapid military strikes, countries like North Korea maintain strategic depth through political and military posturing. Its heavily militarized border with South Korea, reinforced by nuclear capabilities, acts as a psychological and physical buffer against external intervention. Similarly, Israel, despite its small size, has historically sought buffer zones in the form of occupied territories such as the Golan Heights, which provide it with both military advantages and strategic leverage in regional conflicts. In some cases, buffer zones take on an economic or political dimension. The European Union, beyond being a political and economic alliance, serves as a buffer against Russian influence by integrating former Soviet satellite states into a Western-aligned economic and political order. China's Belt and Road Initiative functions similarly, using economic investments to create spheres of influence that serve as economic buffer zones against Western financial dominance. These forms of strategic depth rely less on direct military control and more on creating dependencies and alliances that serve long-term geopolitical goals. Alliances and military bases also contribute to a country's strategic depth. The U.S. military presence in South Korea and Japan extends American influence far from its own shores, while simultaneously preventing adversaries from gaining footholds in critical regions. NATO bases in Eastern Europe serve a similar function, countering Russian influence while providing forward operating positions in case of conflict. These alliances effectively act as buffer zones, reducing the likelihood of direct confrontation on home soil. The concept of strategic depth and buffer zones remains as relevant today as ever, even as the nature of warfare evolves. While traditional land-based buffer zones still exist, the modern world has introduced new dimensions, political, economic, and maritime, that continue to shape global geopolitics. Whether through military alliances, economic dependencies, or territorial control, nations continue to seek ways to protect themselves by creating space between their core interests and potential threats. The struggle for strategic depth is not just about military strategy. It is a fundamental aspect of how nations secure their futures in an uncertain world. I'll leave you to discuss in the comments, in the modern world, is strategic depth still about geography, or has economic and cyber warfare changed the game? You can support us by subscribing if you haven't already. Take care of yourselves, take care of your loved ones, and I'll catch you soon in another video.